If we were to get into a time machine right now, buckle up and head back to Germany 100 years ago. We would witness a real economic boom. The country had finally emerged from the aftermath of World War I, the Revolution, and endless crises. Everyone around was sure that now the main instigator of wars, and Berlin was accused precisely of this, had grown wiser, would calm down, and eternal peace would follow. You probably already know where I'm going with this, or rather, who I'm hinting at. Exactly 100 years ago, Hitler was released from prison, stripped of any right to hold power or even citizenship. He was a laughingstock. People behind his back called him the Bohemian Corporal. A bit later, the patriarch of German politics, President Paul von Hindenburg, would say, "The most this man deserves is to be made postmaster." Sometimes people adding, so he could lick the stamps bearing Hindenburg's portrait. He never became postmaster. Instead, on his hands, this man whom many considered a fool, there would be the blood of tens of millions of people. The Führer's end would come on April 30th, 1945. A week later, in Hitler's residence in the Bavarian Alps, they would find hundreds of paintings, a huge wine cellar, and stacks of documents. Among them was a very heavy manuscript. At first, it was sent off to the archives with the rest of the items, but later, archivists realized exactly what they had discovered in Hitler's house. They would be shocked. Now let's jump to the summer of 1928. The Nazis had just failed in the Reichstag elections. Out of frustration, Hitler wrote a book, a manual on what Germany should do in its foreign policy, which countries to seize, and how. It was a step-by-step plan for world domination, precisely the kind of approach that would later define the diplomacy of the Third Reich. However, at the end of the 1920s, Hitler first found himself unable and then unwilling to publish this book. There was too much bile and hatred in it. He decided to hide it from the public, which did not fully understand who they were voting for in the elections. Today, we're not going to talk about why World War II began. Thousands of hours of YouTube videos already cover that. What's important here is that people often overlook the question, how exactly did Hitler manage to come to power in Germany, and why did the entire country support him? What kind of country was this, which produced Hitler as a political figure? It can't be explained purely by resentment, the bitterness of a nation after losing World War I. That's too simplistic, and simple explanations lead to misunderstandings. Today, we'll take a detailed look at the bubbling cauldron that brought forth Hitler, Germany during the Weimar Republic. We'll figure out why the authorities missed the rise of Nazism, how the Germans outsmarted themselves, what role the Soviet Union played in Weimar's history, and finally, whether Hitler's rise to power was predestined. You're watching our channel, where interesting stories aren't just told, but also explained. Each of us can recall a moment when our life took a sharp turn, usually after something very trivial or random. There was such a moment in German history, too, in November 1918. Germany was overtaken by a wave of uprisings. Workers and soldiers were hastily forming councils, demanding that Kaiser Wilhelm abdicate. It was just like in Russia the year before. The Chancellor, head of the government, had repeatedly asked the Kaiser to step down and hand over the throne to his son or a regent. But Wilhelm was resisting with all his might. At some point, the Chancellor had enough and simply lied to the government, claiming that the Emperor had allegedly abdicated. Outside, a crowd was gathering, and the ministers were scratching their heads, wondering, what do we do next? Who should take the throne? And Scheidemann just ran out onto the balcony and proclaimed Germany a republic, while the Kaiser was still alive. That very moment split the country's history into a before and an after. This is how cheerfully the Germans were seeing off 1918. They had greeted it, however, in a completely different environment. It was the fourth year of the World War, still referred to, at the time, simply as the First World War, though no one knew it would be the first. In Russia, during that period, there had been a second revolution within a year. The head of the government, Lenin, first and foremost appealed to the warring countries with a proposal for peace. Russia's allies, Britain, France, and the USA, did not heed Lenin's call. But the enemies, Germany and the countries in its camp, didn't need to be asked twice. As a result of the negotiations, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, ceding Poland, the Baltic regions, Belarus, and Ukraine to the Germans. Knowing that Russia was no longer a threat, Germany shifted its troops from the Eastern Front to the Western Front and began an offensive. In wartime, the real power in Germany lay with the army, in particular with Chief of the General Staff Paul von Hindenburg and his deputy Erich Ludendorff. They knew this was Germany's last chance. The country's morale, manpower, and finances were already at the breaking point. Yet once again, these human lives were squandered for nothing. The offensive slowed down, then ground to a halt, and ultimately failed. Germany could no longer sustain the war effort. A peace treaty had to be signed. But who would do it? Generals couldn't, since they would never wash off the disgrace. Ludendorff found a way out, bring together a government of liberals and leftists to sign all of this and face the people's wrath themselves. At that time, the Social Democrats, Germany's largest political party, smelled a trap but went into the fray anyway. Their leader, Friedrich Ebert, became Speaker of the Reichstag, another name we'll be hearing a lot of, while another comrade, the same Scheidemann, entered the government. One of his first steps was to release all communists from prison. They immediately began propaganda work, hoping it would play out just like in Russia. But now it was already October. The year was nearing its end. Germany's allies were surrendering one by one, and the entire German army was awaiting peace. When suddenly one of the admirals stood up and declared, "Men, let's deploy the fleet and have one last battle." The sailors were not expecting this trick. They mutinied, but were immediately detained. A solidarity rally gathered at the harbor, and the authorities, without hesitation, drowned it in blood. This was a fatal mistake. In a matter of days, even more massive uprisings ignited in the streets. And it all ended with that very balcony announcement and the establishment of a republic. The new government was led by the Social Democrat Ebert. The generals stood by on the sidelines, rubbing their hands, thinking, "What do you do when everything's on fire and there's no time?" You prioritize, do the most urgent and important tasks yourself, delegate the urgent but less important ones, especially if someone else is just as capable. Schedule the important but not urgent tasks, and strike out the rest. Unfinished business drains your energy more than any stress. Now put yourself in the shoes of the new German authorities. The most pressing and urgent issue was to end the war. On the second day after the change of power, Germany signed a peace treaty. Essentially, it was a capitulation. The Entente demanded all submarines and modern ships. Germany's army had to evacuate all occupied territories and even cede some originally German lands. And as a cherry on top, they had to surrender tens of thousands of artillery pieces, machine guns, aircraft, and locomotives to the Entente. With great difficulty, they solved problem number one. Let's move on. Next, order had to be restored in the streets. The main threat to the new government was the communists who had just been released from prison. This had to be dealt with swiftly, but it was better to delegate the job. Ebert made a deal with the new deputy chief of the General Staff. The government promised the army work and secret funding, while the General Staff would support the new regime and drive the communists out. They created special volunteer corps, the Freikorps, to carry this out. Freikorps were like Hell's Angels from American biker gangs, but fully funded by the state. Their symbol wasn't a Harley-Davidson, but rather the good old Mauser, which they aimed at the communists. Soviet Russia could not calmly watch what was happening in the homeland of Karl Marx. In December 1918, Lenin sent one of his top diplomats, Karl Radek, to Berlin. He acted as a special envoy counselor. He transmitted the Kremlin's wishes, shared Soviet experience with the Germans, and observed how the German Communist Party was taking shape. Everything was going smoothly until Prime Minister Ebert fired Berlin's chief of police, who was sympathetic to the communists, and appointed a new officer who was ready to show force. Disturbances broke out. Radek quickly assessed the situation and advised the Communists to leave immediately, but they wouldn't listen, and they paid dearly for it. The Freikorps swiftly crushed the unrest and then killed the leaders of the revolt, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. It was in their honor that countless squares, streets, villages, and even towns throughout the Soviet Union were later named. Besides the communist threat, the government had another legal concern. Its authority needed to be formally established. So at the end of January, elections were held for a constituent assembly, which then adopted a constitution and approved the peace treaty. To keep things calm, the assembly convened in the small town of Weimar, almost 300 kilometers from Berlin. From this comes the name of the entire era, from the end of the First World War up to Hitler, the Weimar Republic. Essentially the same Germany, but with a Republican rebranding. They started reforming from the top. The country introduced the position of Reich President, effectively replacing the Kaiser. Well, in the new Republic format, that position went to the socialist Ebert. He had already been just about the most important figure, and now his status was cemented. And Scheidemann, the very man who proclaimed the new country from a balcony, became Chancellor, i.e., Prime Minister, the second most important person in the state. While the Weimar government was drafting the Constitution, the victors in Paris were painstakingly finalizing the terms of the peace treaty. The Germans were not allowed to participate. It's crucial to note that Germany was declared guilty of starting the First World War and was forced to pay reparations. They eventually settled on 132 billion gold marks, worth around $600 billion today, 1.5 times Germany's annual GDP. This was the second capitulation in a row, this time a political one. Chancellor Scheidemann refused to sign such a treaty and resigned, thereafter leaving big politics for good. He left behind his successor, Gustav Bauer. Bauer tried to negotiate with the Entente on his own terms, but the French threatened to break the armistice. Yet Germany no longer had the strength to fight, so Bauer had to persuade the Constituent Assembly to sign the treaty. They did so in June 1919 in Versailles, deliberately chosen once again to humiliate Germany as much as possible. The Treaty of Versailles stunned the Germans. Everyone at once forgot how they had longed only a year earlier for the endless bloodshed to end. A wave of mass myth-making spread, and the stab-in-the-back conspiracy theory blossomed. Supposedly, the rats in the rear ate all our bread, drank all our beer, and staged a revolution while the German soldier was heroically attacking the enemy. It's no surprise the entire High Command was happy to endorse these rumors, shifting all responsibility off themselves. The legend quickly spread across Europe. Everyone believed it, from the officers of the Entente to Germany's new government, which had orchestrated, proclaimed, and signed all these measures in the first place. President Ebert would occasionally let slip remarks along the lines of, "The German soldier wasn't defeated on the battlefield. It was all the politicians' fault." All right then, who exactly stabbed us in the back? If you'd asked the average German in those years, he might have given you any of three answers: the Bolsheviks, the Jews, or both. He might also have brought up events in Bavaria. In February 1919, in Munich, a monarchist officer shot and killed the socialist prime minister, and promptly the Bavarian Soviet Republic was proclaimed within Germany. It's worth explaining that the German Empire had been a kind of commonwealth of principalities, not unlike a federation. Under Weimar, they kept the borders but turned the principalities into republics, and Bavaria was the first swallow in this process. The murder of the socialist leader radicalized the situation. The new authorities armed the workers, formed a Red Army, and set about defending the revolution. From Russia immediately flowed money and advice, but the Kremlin understood that this was doomed. They knew the Bavarian Soviet Republic's leaders well enough to see that they were adventurers and demagogues. Indeed, the Soviet Republic there lasted less than a month. By early May, it had been crushed by the same Freikorps. In that short time, the Bavarian communists had done so much damage that they scared locals away from leftist ideas for a long time. And yes, it was amid the flames of the Bavarian Revolution that a certain mustachioed corporal got his first taste of politics. In 1837, a peasant woman named Maria Schicklgruber gave birth to a boy, Alois. The father field on his record was blank. Later, Maria married a local miller, Johann Georg Hudler, spelled with a D. When Alois was 39, both of his parents had died, and his step-uncle, Johann Hudler, acknowledged Alois as his son and gave him his surname. Then a local cleric made a fateful typo. Alois Schicklgruber became Hitler, the T being the crucial letter. 9 years later, Alois married his own niece, Clara Pölzl. It was from this odd union that Adolf was born. Naturally, in the Third Reich, Hitler's genealogy was tidied up. They were obsessed with eugenics, and inbreeding and incest were considered a major shame. Adolf Hitler himself was born in 1889 in the Austrian town of Braunau, on the border with Germany. His father, Alois, worked for the local customs office. Adolf spent his entire childhood on the road. Alois was constantly reassigned to different parts of the border on both sides. Even then, the boy began to think it was strange. Same people, same language, yet different countries. At the time, this was a popular question in Austria-Hungary. Nationality meant a lot. Hitler's family belonged to the empire's primary titular nation, although they represented less than a quarter of the total population. The second largest ethnic group was the Hungarians, 19%, and a large share of Austria-Hungary's subjects were Slavs. Another 10% included Romanians, Jews, Italians, and various others. Look at how Europe appeared around 1815, after the Napoleonic Wars. Where Germany is now, there was total chaos. Dozens of years of philosophers and politicians debating the best way to unite hundreds of principalities into a single country. There were two main options. The Greater German solution, unite all Germans under Habsburg rule, essentially merging all of Germany with Austria-Hungary. But then one would have to bring in millions of Slavs and Hungarians, which didn't sound great, or the Lesser German solution, which meant unification without Austria, centered on the Kingdom of Prussia. Ultimately, the second option was realized. In 1871, the Germans finally got their own unified state, but many considered that path halfway. There's one people, that people has a spirit. The spirit expresses itself through thought, meaning language and culture. So if Austrian culture is German, why isn't Austria part of Germany? This thinking was called pan-Germanism. We talk more about it in our video on fairy tales and nationalism, how the Brothers Grimm ruthlessly distorted Bavarian and Saxon dialects, among others, in favor of a single German national memory, all to serve the fashionable romantic nationalism of that era. We don't know if Hitler read Little Red Riding Hood with rapt attention, but his formative years came at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. Pan-Germanism was a trend, but it wasn't yet grounds for starting global wars. Uniting Germans in Germany and Austria became Hitler's idée fixe, and he was hardly alone. The Treaty of Versailles explicitly forbade annexing Austria. German political parties, from right to left, were shocked by that requirement. The young Hitler experienced the multi-ethnic palette of Austria-Hungary in full in Vienna. He arrived in 1907 to apply to the Academy of Fine Arts. His father had already died. His mother was in the final stages of cancer. The Academy rejected him. Your cityscapes are okay, almost like photographs, but there are no people in them. These are incomplete works. Young man, try the architecture program. But the architecture school also turned him down. He needed a secondary school diploma, which Adolf did not have. His mother died, the money ran out, and Hitler became a drifter without any roots. Anyway, let's return to Germany of those times. Vienna was the cultural hub of continental Europe, a chief rival to Paris. There's a meme online claiming that Hitler, Stalin, Trotsky, Freud, and Tito all lived in the city simultaneously. That's a big stretch, But still, the city's population in the early 20th century surpassed 2 million, which is actually more than it is now. Quite astonishing considering the world population has more than quintupled since then. The mayor of Vienna at the time was Karl Lueger, a pan-Germanist and a vehement anti-Semite. A near-ironclad rule came into effect. The things that captivate us in childhood and youth shape our entire lives. The young Hitler listened to the mayor's speeches, saw the reality of life on the streets, and formed answers to two timeless questions. Who is to blame, and what is to be done? He started with the latter. If the Habsburg monarchy could not be saved, it was time to leave this Babylon and go to Germany to join his fellow like-minded compatriots. In 1913, when Russia was celebrating 300 years of the Romanov dynasty, Adolf received his father's inheritance and moved to Munich. 1 year later, the World War caught up with him there. In a patriotic frenzy, Hitler, then already 25, joined a Bavarian infantry regiment and ended up on the Western Front. It's hard to say anything definitive about Hitler's military service since eyewitness accounts vary widely. Some said he just sat behind a desk at headquarters, others called him a hero at the front. Some described him as sociable, others as unlikable. Some remembered his racist preaching, yet many never heard him speak of anything like that. The main thing for us to understand here is that for centuries, Germany had been built up on national romanticism, and World War I blew the lid off that boiling pot. Those who served on the front felt it more than anyone, Hitler included. That boiling army pot contained a broth. In the trenches, it didn't matter whether you were from Swabia, Holstein, Prussia, or even if you had an Austrian passport like Hitler did. The trenches forged a new identity. You might survive, die, or be wounded, but you couldn't lose your honor. That was how Hitler and many of his peers saw it. The Imperial Army became, for the future Führer, the epitome of the Volksgemeinschaft, that is, the notion of a people's community. For them, war was not horror and misery, but a kind of national team-building session. In the Army, they witnessed the vision of a united nation, equal without class struggle. Hitler spent the end of the war in a field hospital, having been gassed on the Belgian front. After his discharge, he returned to Munich. Initially, he was assigned to guard a camp of Russian POWs, just like the main character Paul in Erich Maria Remarque's novel All Quiet on the Western Front. And when the flames of revolution erupted in that region, Hitler decided to go into politics, since nothing more dramatic was going on. In April 1919, he was even elected to the Soldiers' Council of the Bavarian Republic. Then, when Freikorps units crushed that republic, Hitler was suddenly threatened with execution. This episode is rarely discussed. To avoid accountability, Hitler quickly betrayed the most ardent communist comrades. Many of the Freikorps officers who had carried out repressions later joined Hitler in the Nazi Party, which already existed under another name. In other words, Hitler started collaborating with communists before he worked with the Nazis. Two principal adversaries in the new Germany, two political forces that would thrash each other for 15 years, appeared within a week of each other. The German Communist Party was formed on December 30th, 1918, while the German Workers' Party, future NSDAP, was created on January 5th, 1919. One could make a grim joke that it's a bad idea to spend the New Year holidays founding radical organizations, but Germans weren't in the mood to laugh. The first leader of the German Workers' Party, then just DAP, was Anton Drexler. He was a locksmith for a Munich train depot, yet during the war he had been part of the local ultranationalist circles, not skinheads with runic tattoos, but rather respectable journalists, philosophers, and even financiers. His political coach was, for the record, the director of MAN, the truck and bus manufacturer. It was this man who suggested Drexler create a party that would advance the idea of German greatness among working people. Workers worldwide were only just becoming voters. There were a lot of them, and they wanted something to grasp in the ideological chaos. So the work began. Well, more or less. By January 1919, the future Hitler Party had all of 7 members. By May, there were 10, and by August, 38. Dozens of similar parties and circles existed in Munich alone, hundreds, if not thousands, across the country. The authorities needed to keep a close eye on them, lest they try something like the Communists had. The task of infiltrating Drexler's party as an informant fell to Adolf Hitler. You read that right. Hitler started his political career not only as a member of a soldiers' council, but also as a snitch. Adolf attended the party's meetings, listened, and realized something. The ideas were close to his heart, blaming the French, the British, the Communists, and, of course, the Jews for everything. And the future, naturally, lay with the workers, a total Volksgemeinschaft. But the execution was sloppy. They mumbled half-heartedly, didn't truly engage the people. At one meeting in the fall of 1919, Hitler took the floor and delivered such an impassioned speech that he immediately dazzled the party leadership, including Drexler. They offered Hitler membership and put him in charge of propaganda. He began hosting open lectures, distributing leaflets, 3 events a month on average. By then, he had already decided to ditch his career as an informant. After 6 months, Hitler wrote the party's program and convinced Drexler to tack on the words National Socialist to the name, thus forming the NSDAP. This further emphasized the fusion of the working class and the cause of national rebirth. Hitler only became the party's full-fledged leader a year later, in the summer of 1921. It all happened in a messy way. While he was in Berlin, some party members plotted to kick Hitler out. He came back, threw a tantrum reminiscent of the film Downfall, the infamous meme where a furious Führer rants at the end of the war. Drexler caved and, to avoid trouble, gave Hitler full power. At that point, Hitler decided to create the Stormtroopers, SA, both his personal security detail and a formidable force for street fights. By the way, he had gone to Berlin not just to loiter, but to connect with radicals there, primarily the June Club on Mottstrasse. The June Club was an offshoot of the Young Conservatives. At the time, they were the main right-wing alternative to Nazism. Munich had the philosopher Oswald Spengler, Decline of the West, while Berlin had Arthur Müller, Vandenbroek. Hitler even borrowed from him the name for his future Germany project, the Third Reich. The Weimar authorities paid little attention to these small local clubs. Let them chatter, we've got bigger fish to fry, we can't be chasing mice. The German government already had enough problems, starting with a massive crisis of legitimacy. We need a brief look at Weimar's internal politics. The situation was dire. First off, not everyone liked what the country had become or where it was headed. In fact, only 3 moderate parties, the Social Democrats, the Liberals, and the Catholic Center, supported the Republic unequivocally. They held 3/4 of the seats in Parliament, but by the first post-war election in summer 1920, their combined vote share dropped to 43%. Throughout Weimar's history, it never again crossed 50%. So support was there, but shakily so. Government coalitions rotated every 6 months on average, all relying on a handshake. Well, the president's nod, really. Weimar's constitution was progressive in terms of civil liberties. Women got the vote in 1918 before Britain, France, or the U.S. did. There was full freedom of speech and religion, and referendums were permitted, which could even dissolve Parliament. But then there's that German stereotype, Ordnung or order. And who enforces order best? A constitutional article that let the president pass laws bypassing the Reichstag. President Ebert used it freely. In his final year in office, he enacted it 134 times. That's practically 3 times a week, with breaks for lunch, weekends, and a couple of pints of unfiltered beer. Nobody foresaw how such a clause might be abused down the line. Another problem was the endless uprisings and unrest. Initially, these came from the same officers and monarchists with whom the Weimar regime had just teamed up to crush the communists. In March 1920, by Versailles' demands, the authorities disbanded the Ehrhardt Brigade, one of the largest Freikorps units. Nationalist officers objected, the president refused them, so they launched a coup in Berlin. Ebert then did a Kerensky. He fled the capital and called on workers to strike, hoping to nip the coup in the bud. It worked. The putsch flopped. A year later, the Russian Bolsheviks won their civil war, so the notion of exporting the world revolution loomed large. At the urging of Lenin's envoy in Berlin, Karl Radek, the Comintern tested the waters in Germany, but they failed again. Sure, they stirred up a few strikes. Some street skirmishes followed, but then the Weimar government brought out the army and artillery, and the communists lost all enthusiasm. Right-wing radicals crawled out again, like the little mole in a Czech cartoon. Hermann Ehrhardt, one of the right-wing putsch leaders, turned to semi-underground partisan tactics. In the summer of 1920, he formed the organization Consul with a simple goal: to eliminate inconvenient politicians and stage acts of terror. Their methods resembled those of the SR combat organization in Russia, whose leader was also a major provocateur. In the summer of 1921, they assassinated the former Minister of Finance, who had signed the 1918 armistice. The following year, Consul operatives killed the Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau simply because he had established diplomatic relations with Moscow. Other terrorist groups soon followed Consul's lead. Their hits were later termed Femimord, murders as a warning, in the press. In a few years, the far right lynched hundreds across the country, most of all in Bavaria, targeting not just politicians. Here's one example from the autumn of 1920. Maria Zandmeier served as a maid for a Bavarian aristocrat who kept a stash of weapons at home for the Freikorps, just as gun ownership for citizens was being banned. Dutiful Maria saw a new poster about the law on the table and thought she should inform someone in authority. She didn't go to the police, oddly enough, but to a print shop. They said they would look into it and report to the appropriate people. And then they reported her to the local Freikorps boss. A few days later, 3 men in a car stopped her in the street, offering to drive her in for questioning. They took her to the outskirts, strangled her, and dumped her body in a nearby wood. Attached to her corpse was a note: "You filthy traitor to the motherland. The Black Hand has judged you." Each of the 3 killers later joined the Nazi Party. One rose to a leadership position in the SA, ultimately dying in the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, thanks to Hitler. Another, the driver, got into a fight with the movement, turned anti-fascist, and returned to Bavaria to live peacefully into his 90s. The third murderer also joined the SA, reached the rank of general, and pretty much stayed off the radar. Finally, in Weimar's early years, the country was overtaken by a migration crisis. Destitute, half-naked, neatly torn to pieces. That's how the white émigré Roman Gull described Germany in those times. Around the early 1920s, Berlin became the capital of Russian emigration. Some people remember the philosopher's ship, but that was autumn of 1922, at the tail end of this exodus. By then, hundreds of thousands had already fled revolutionary turmoil in Russia to Germany, their former enemy in the Great War, and they all needed to be fed. Berlin's appeal was no accident. First, it was geographically close to Russia. If the Soviet regime were to fall, and many fervently believed it was about to any day now, you could pack up fast and race back. Second, many of them spoke German and felt a cultural bond, especially the nobility, the most educated social class. Then there was Germany's industrial development and half-decent living standards, even in the post-war rubble. Unlike France or Belgium, Berlin hadn't endured any actual World War I battles. Finally, the Russians there, despite the recent conflicts, were generally treated better than they would have been, say, in the Baltics or Poland. 500,000 Russians lived in Germany, and nobody demanded they form any artificial ghetto. A Russian émigré in Berlin might only interact with his local tobacconist or landlord. It was there, in 1922, that the fanatic monarchist Sergei Taboritsky shot and killed Vladimir Nabokov Sr., a leader of the Cadet Party in the old Imperial Duma. Vladimir Nabokov Jr. recalled that in all his years in Germany, he hadn't made a single German friend and hadn't even learned the language. Germans were, in his words, just unfamiliar figures lurking around while Russians used their infrastructure. Around 1923, Berlin's status as the capital of the Russian émigré community began shifting to Paris. For one thing, Berlin was moving closer to Moscow, leading some émigrés to fear extradition. They'd return not in triumph, but be handed straight to the GPU for interrogation. Also, German authorities started cracking down on migrants, and crucially, by 1923, the economic and political situation had grown so dire that Germany itself became unbearable for many. Let's sketch out a rough conclusion. Germany had suffered a failed revolution, a humiliating defeat in the war, 6 uprisings of varying magnitude, the incursion of death squads and covert vigilantes, a flood of refugees, and now a migration crisis. And we still haven't even touched on the economy. Does all this inevitably mean Nazism had to triumph there? Not necessarily, yet by any measure, the country was mired in crisis. And that's when the beer started flowing.